If you enjoy what you hear here today, please consider supporting me on my Patreon page. Every dollar helps, and you get to see content that you won't see here.
Chapter 17. Checkmate. Silverquill had been reading for a little over an hour before the sound of a door opening and closing rang through the library. With it, the sound of two voices heatedly arguing made the presence of the librarian and her assistant known.
"Honestly, Spike, I can't believe you would even say that. I thought I taught you better than that,"
said an indignant voice from around the corner. "Me? What about you? You're supposed to be the smart one, Twilight, so how in the world could you make such an obvious mistake?" replied a young voice in disdain. Silver looked up from his book with a frown on his face. He hadn't the faintest idea what the two could be arguing about in such heated tones, but from the sound of it, it had to be serious. He quickly marked his page and closed the book, setting it aside as the sound of the two arguing voices got closer. Whatever it was that was being debated so animatedly, Silver was going to find out fairly soon.
"Well, of course I'm smart,"
Twilight said hotly.
"which is why I'm obviously right."
"Delirious is what you are," Spike replied with a sharp voice. The two rounded the corner into the sitting room, Spike riding on Twilight's back with his arms crossed in front of him and a stern look on his face that was mirrored by Twilight as she glared at the little dragon. Floating beside Twilight in a magical aura was a large plastic bag that had the words Bonbons Candy written across, next to a few grinning Nightmare Night jack-o'-lanterns.
"The only delirious one here is... Oh!"
Twilight began to say before she noticed that Silverquill was sitting there, staring bemusedly at the two as they argued like a bitter old married couple. She interrupted her tirade to shoot a smile at him that only left him more confused.
"Why, good morning,
Silverquill! Just the stallion I needed!" cried Spike as he threw his claws in the air with relief, almost knocking the bag stuffed with candy out of the air. "Would you do me a favor and set this crazy mare straight for me? She just won't listen to reason!" Silver raised an eyebrow at the dragon before pointedly looking at Twilight with a question in his eyes. She huffed, unhappy with being interrupted, and blew an errant strand of her mane out of her face.
"It seems that Spike here has been hanging around the wrong sort of ponies and has gotten some crazy ideas in his head. Ideas that I think are just absurd,"
Twilight said passionately. Spike stuck his tongue out at the back of her head.
"So, we need you to set the record straight for us,"
Twilight continued seriously.
"and I'm sure that you'll be able to help me open his eyes."
Silver stared at the two of them, wondering what it was that could have possibly gotten them so riled up at each other. After a moment of silence, he nodded hesitantly, not entirely sure he wanted to be dragged into this, whatever it was. "All right, then. What seems to be the problem?" he asked calmly. "What we want to know is," Spike promptly said before taking a deep breath, "what is the best Nightmare Night candy? Because I say that it's raw candy, but Twilight here says that it's
"Chocolate-covered raisins,"
she interrupted primly, causing Spike to mime gagging with a finger in his mouth.
"So, which one do you think is the best? Chocolate-covered raisins, right?"
"Or rock candy, as it so obviously is?" Spike asked eagerly. Silverquill sat in silence for a good amount of time, his gaze flicking back and forth between the unicorn and the dragon. His face was more expressionless and impassive than that of a champion poker player, and his body didn't betray even the slightest twitch as he thought long and hard about their quandary. When he finally took a deep breath to answer their question, the two leaned forward, eagerly anticipating his answer. "Well, if you really want my opinion," he started slowly, eliciting eager nods from his two listeners, "I've always considered candy corn to be the best." The two stared at him in dumb silence, as though they couldn't believe their ears. And Silverquill stared back without blinking an eye. Finally, Spike threw his arms into the air in dismay. "Of all the candy corn? That's even worse!" he cried. Twilight merely shook her head sadly, her ears drooping with deep regret.
"Silverquill, I'm sorry to say this, but
She looked up at him and met his eyes with a remorseful gaze.
I'm going to have to kick you out. You have until tomorrow to pack up your stuff and leave.
And with that, Twilight turned away from him and walked straight into the kitchen to store the floating bag of candy, though she made sure to shoot him a brief wink and a smile as she did so to show him that it was all in jest. The dragon on her back letting out the occasional distraught cry of, "Philistine!" and "What has the world come to?" Silver chuckled and shook his head in amused disbelief. He hoisted himself up from his comfortable seat, his joints sore from a lack of use, and went off to join Twilight in the kitchen, not planning to say anything in particular to her at that moment, instead just wanting to be in her company. The afternoon passed far too quickly for Silverquill's liking. The sun quickly fell from its point in the sky and was now sitting comfortably on the horizon, getting ready to duck its head underneath to make way for the moon to herald the arrival of Nightmare Night. Silverquill had nothing to do but sit and wait with the librarian and wallow in the joy he felt as the two engaged in conversation to whittle away the minutes until the laughing screams of merry fools inevitably called them to the streets, where they'd see a Ponyville bedecked in cobwebs, jack-o'-lanterns, and smiling fake ghosts as the minuscule monsters headed from door to door, demanding candy under pain of a fright. They spent their few free hours before then in each other's company, playing board games, talking about whatever passed through their mind, and eagerly planning the events of the upcoming festivities they were about to partake in. There were plans of apple bobbing and pumpkin throwing at Sweet Apple Acres with the Apple family, spider throwing and pin the arm on the zombie in the town square, and a quick peek at the best costume competition that was held every year that Twilight swore she was this close to winning last year.
It's not my fault no pony hears and knows about obscure unicorn history,
she mumbled under her breath as her rook quickly took out another one of Silverquill's pawns, leaving its path to his forces wide open. Silver grimaced, acknowledging her complaint with an easy nod as he studied the checkered board that sat on a small end table in front of the two ponies, Silverquill on one side and Twilight Sparkle on the opposite. He carefully studied the positions of his black pieces and Twilight's white ones, noting with a twinge of irritation how many more white pieces there were than black. "It's a shame," he agreed quietly, most of his focus still on the board. Twilight huffed in agreement and leaned back in her chair as she waited patiently for Silver to make his move. After a few moments of contemplative silence, Silver wrapped his rook in his magic and quickly slid it horizontally across the board, where it rested just out of range of Twilight's bishop, knight, and pawns that had been holding up the right side of the board firmly in her control since the beginning of the game. He smiled slightly in satisfaction at his well-planned move. Twilight hummed thoughtfully as she contemplated her reply. While her eyes were downturned towards the board, Silver took the moment, just like he did for every one of her turns, to quietly observe her with the fascination and awe of a pony watching a majestic and dangerous creature in its natural habitat. Because to Silver, that's what Twilight was. A specimen that fascinated him to no end, filling him with a warmth like no other just when he laid eyes on her, but also instilled a cold sense of fear at the same time. It was the fear of uncertainty, the fear that he was blindly stumbling through a dark cave, not sure if he was going to find the hoard of treasure or the dragon that guarded it. She idly chewed on the inside of her cheek as she carefully planned her next move, no doubt contemplating and dismissing strategy after strategy in mere seconds somewhere in that fearsome brain of hers. Silverquill always fancied himself as a good chess player. It was a game that required patience and cleverness, something that Silverquill definitely had. Twilight, however, didn't seem to read the same rulebook that Silverquill did, as all of her turns were made after only about 10 seconds of thought and were always debilitating, forcing Silver to rethink his entire game plan. Silver cursed inwardly as Twilight's bishop glided from its starting position at the top of the board to knock over a pawn and rest on a few squares away from his king. He wasn't in check yet, but judging from the gleam in Twilight's eye, he knew he wouldn't have to wait long until that was the case. So much for going on the offensive, he thought to himself bitterly as he studied his options. He quickly edged his queen a square to the left so that it would be able to intercept the bishop if it decided to get a bit too touchy-feely with his king. He looked up at Twilight to see her grinning happily. "What are you smiling about?" Silver asked her with mock irritation. Twilight's grin grew wider.
Oh, nothing,
she said in a sing-song voice. Silver narrowed his eyes and looked back at the board suspiciously. As intelligent that Twilight was, she didn't have the best poker face, so he was starting to regret his previous move. Unless that's what she wants me to think, he thought with a furrow of his brow as he sharply looked back up at the offending mare, only to find her eyes pointed back down towards the board. Her horn quickly flared up, and a pawn of hers took a quick hop forwards. She looked back up at Silver with the same knowing smile on her face. Oh, how he loved that smile. No offense to the Alicorn princesses, but the sun and moon themselves couldn't compare to its radiance, and the way it warmed his heart to see. Silver tried to scowl to show her that her mind games weren't going to work on him. Oh no, not on Silver Quill. But as much as he tried, he found her smile to be too infectious for him to resist. He felt his own smile form to meet hers, so that the two ponies simply sat there, grinning at each other like a couple of fools. They held each other's gazes for a long, blissful moment. Not a word was spoken for a time, because to describe their feelings with words would do them injustice. Silver's smile grew more wistful and amused as Twilight's face began to get flushed as pink crept into her cheeks. She looked away, embarrassed, and Silver felt his heart flutter as her eyes shyly met his once again, reminding him somewhat of the shy yellow Pegasus that Twilight had introduced him to before.
It's your turn,
she said with a shy smile. Silver blinked, somewhat startled to be knocked out of his reverie, and nodded before regretfully looking back down at the board to plan his next move. As soon as he did so, he could feel a craving deep in his chest to look back up and take her in his sights and never let her leave them. Oh, if he was grasping at straws before just to prolong his loss for as long as possible, now he had less of a chance than a fish on dry land. He forced himself to concentrate, to think logically and clearly, and after careful planning, strategizing, and contemplating, he finally moved his king one square to the left. He looked back up and felt the same burst of joy that he felt so many times before as he looked at the mare. Butterflies fluttered in his stomach, and the tips of his lips instinctively started to turn upwards. "Your turn," he said with a smile. Instead of making her next move in a matter of seconds, like she usually did, crippling him with one deft move, Twilight simply looked at Silver Quill with a confused look on her face. Her head cocked, and her brow furrowed slightly.
You know,
she began slowly, getting a feel for the words as she was about to say them.
You seem different today.
Silver tilted his head, but his smile never left his face. Different how? He asked simply, not really caring too much whether or not he was acting differently. He was too happy to care about anything right now. Too happy to care about anything but the mare in front of him. Twilight tapped her chin and eyed Silver Quill contemplatively. She ran her eyes over him, taking in his presence as she considered her words.
You seem looser, she
said cryptically. When Silver's eyebrows started to rise, she explained further.
Less tense, I mean. Like you put down a really heavy thing that you'd been carrying on your shoulders or something.
Silver blinked. How do you figure? Twilight looked down and started fiddling with her hooves, looking like she was almost starting to regret mentioning it in the first place. She grinned hesitantly.
You're smiling a lot more lately. That's fairly new for you,
she answered.
You don't usually smile, not unless something good happens. But now...
She looked at him more boldly, her previous shyness slowly evaporating.
Well, You're smiling right now, and all you're doing is playing a game of chess. That's very unusual for you,
she said matter-of-factly. Zirkle was taken aback. His mouth was open, but no words came out, and his eyes were wide with surprise, yet he could still feel a smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. I see, he murmured, not breaking eye contact with Twilight. He clenched his jaw unconsciously, his small smile becoming a bit more wistful, and he chuckled. I didn't realize that. Twilight looked at him with concern.
It's not a bad thing,
she said hastily, trying to take back any insult she might have accidentally given.
I know you don't smile often because you're miserable or anything, that's just the way you are. Like, there's this one donkey who lives in Ponyville who's nearly never smiles, but he's still a very—
Silver cut her off with a raising hoof and looked at her with tender eyes. It's all right, Twilight. I understand. You were just remarking on a simple observation that you'd made. Nothing more, nothing less. His unnatural smile grew. And I think you're right, to be honest. I have been unusually expressive lately, although I only just realized it once you mentioned it. Twilight closed her mouth and nodded in understanding, a hint of concern still visible in her furrowed brow and shining eyes.
Do you know why that is, though?
She asked. Silverquill took a moment to just look at the mare, taking in every line, curve, and feature that he could. Eventually, he found that he could no longer stand to see the worried look that she had for him, finding that it caused a continuous pang of discomfort deep in his chest. So he moved his gaze back downward towards the chessboard. I guess I just never had anything in particular to smile about, he answered with a non-committal shrug.
And do you have something to smile about now?
Silver glanced back up to find that Twilight's concern had been replaced with idle curiosity. He shot her a smile. I guess I do, he answered cryptically. Twilight's brow furrowed in confusion, but before she could ask anything else, Silver interrupted her train of thought in an effort to steer the conversation into something less personal. It's your turn, he urged gently as he gestured towards the board with a huff. Twilight blinked in surprise.
Oh, right,
she exclaimed softly before promptly igniting her horn and moving a knight that she had left at the side of the board since the beginning of the game. It came to a rest right next to her bishop.
Check.
Silver's eyes widened as he resisted the urge to groan. Twilight giggled from across the board, hiding her smile behind her huff as Silver frantically looked for a way out of check that wouldn't put him in any worse of a situation than he was in now. Silver grimaced in distaste as he concentrated on planning around every possible move that she could make. He devoted every ounce of his brain power to recognize every outcome and scenario that would end with him either losing or maneuvering out of Twilight's plan. Twilight, however, as entertaining as it was for her to watch Silverquill mumble to himself as he desperately planned his next move, was starting to get bored of waiting on him.
So,
she started slowly. Silver's ears perked up to let her know that he was listening, but he kept his eyes glued to the board.
You said that you found something to smile about.
At this, his eyes flicked up to her.
Do you mind if I ask what it was?
Silver's expression was inscrutable for a few seconds before he sighed and looked away. He really didn't want to talk about this with Twilight right now. He was still too confused, too conflicted with his own thoughts and emotions, something that still prevented him from being able to express himself properly. So far, he had been going on in the hopes that after he talked to Rarity, and as the day progressed, things would start to make a bit more sense. This seemed to be more and more unlikely of ever actually happening, however, as he was just as lost as he was before. Silver stammered, too unsure to form any legible sentences. On one hoof, he really wanted to get the entire thing off his chest and just bare his soul to Twilight and let the pieces fall where they may. On the other, just the thought of doing that made his heart pound in his chest, and he started to break out into a cold sweat. Twilight looked at him curiously, but his eyes were completely inscrutable. All that she could tell was the unusual joviality that had been showing before had all but disappeared, and been replaced with Silver's usual stoic expression, as he idly wrapped his magic around his king and levitated it one square away from danger. Silver sighed dejectedly once more. "I'll make you a deal, Twilight," he said suddenly. When Twilight cocked her eyebrow at him, he continued. "I'll tell you why I've been so happy lately, but not now. Later if you feel up to listening. But I can't do it now." He met her eyes. "Is that all right?" He looked at her imploringly, and Twilight was taken aback. As stoic as his face was, even she could recognize the desperation in his eyes. He wasn't just asking her. He was pleading. Twilight felt a lump in her throat form. She contemplated the implications of this. What could possibly evoke such happiness and desperation from a pony? Regardless of what it was, Twilight gave him her best reassuring smile and nodded.
"I'd be happy to listen to whatever you have to say, Silverquill,"
she said gently. Something was up with him, she knew. She didn't know whether something was wrong or not, but she knew that he needed a listening ear, and Twilight's years under Princess Celestia had trained her to be the best listener on this side of Equestria. Silver's smile returned with gusto, and he nodded gratefully at her. "Thank you," he said simply, but meaningfully. Twilight smiled back.
"You're welcome, Silver. And I'm sorry."
Silver looked at her with confusion. "Sorry for what?" he asked.
"Because,"
she said as she levitated her queen and dragged it diagonally down the board, so that it was horizontal of Silver's king.
"that's checkmate."
Silver couldn't resist a groan this time, as all of his hard work up until then was rendered completely moot. Knowing his opponent, every move that he had made had been playing directly into her master plan, so that his defeat had been certain from the very beginning. He looked at the board mournfully, trying in vain to find an escape for his king, but he was well and truly beaten. He sighed glumly and shook his head in despair.
"Oh, come on,"
Twilight chirped happily from across the board.
"You did well. If we play another game, you might even be able to beat me,"
she said enthusiastically. Silver twisted his mouth and gave her a wry look, but that did nothing to stop her enthusiasm.
"What do you say? Best 5 out of 9?
She asked excitedly. Silver glared at her for a moment before he started to aggressively rearrange the pieces to their original positions. "I'm gonna get at least one game on her if it's the last thing I do," he thought grimly as Twilight eagerly moved a pawn of hers forward, no doubt already planning on how she was going to destroy Silverquill much like she already had 4 times before. The board was rearranged in a matter of seconds, and both Twilight and Silver settled in their seats. Silver ready to fight for his honor, dignity, and good name, and Twilight ready to beat him without any discernible effort. Twilight scrutinized the board, letting her eyes roam from one piece to the other, mentally going over each and every possible move that could be made in that big brain of hers. Finally, a lavender aura wrapped around a pawn, delicately lifted it from the board as though it were a living, breathing thing, and set it back down 1 square forward. "Twilight!" The mare's eyes flew open as a speeding purple and green blur flew down the stairs and threw itself at the back of Twilight's neck, wrapping its arms around her and yammering excitedly. With her concentration well and effectively shattered, Twilight's magic moved the pawn in her grip more than she had meant, sending it careening into Silver's black army and sending half of its pieces careening around the board. "It's time to go! It's time to go! It's time to go!" the excitable little dragon exclaimed, as it crawled up Twilight's neck so that it was lying over her head like an unusually active hat. Twilight winced as chants of "Come on, come on, come on!" filled her ears, making them lay against the back of her head in an effort to save them from the cacophony that was tangled up in her mane.
Calm down, Spike! Calm down!
She said irritably as she raised her front hooves and lifted the dragon off of his perch, setting him down on the hardwood floor next to her and eyeing him reproachfully.
Goodness, Spike! I know you're excited, but you don't need to tackle me,
she said, straightening out her mussed-up mane. The little dragon bounced unashamedly from where he stood, grinning up at her for all he was worth.
Sorry,
he chirped, although he looked anything but.
But Nightmare Mind has started. We gotta go!
Silver chuckled at his enthusiasm and glanced out the nearest window. Sure enough, there were several groups of fillies and colts that were roaming around the streets, eagerly dragging their nonplussed, overwhelmed adults behind them as they started showing off their new costumes to one another, their shrieks of laughter managing to permeate the glass.
All right. Don't get your tail in a knot,
she said reassuringly. She glanced at Silverquill and shot him an apologetic smile.
Sorry, but I think we're gonna have to save this game for another time.
Silver smiled and shook his head dismissively. That's all right. He glanced down and nudged his fallen king with a huff. I didn't really feel like losing again anyway. Twilight laughed, making Silver's smile grow even wider. As much as it irked him to lose 5 games of chess in a row, it was worth it to be able to hear that laugh. He briefly reflected on his new change of attitude that was almost assuredly brought out entirely due to Twilight herself. Well, he never used to smile much, not finding much of a reason to unless something worth smiling for was happening right at that moment, and even then never with much enthusiasm. Now though, he found himself smiling at just the slightest provocation, often enough to make his underused cheek muscles sore from the unnatural stress they were being put through. Spike groaned and started to tap his feet impatiently. Come on, you guys! You can make doe eyes at each other anytime you want, but not right now! We're wasting time! He protested loudly. Twilight blushed profusely and turned back to the little dragon with an annoyed huff.
Why don't you go and get into your costume first, and then we can leave,
she asked pointedly as she fought down a red tinge in her cheeks. The baby dragon's foot stilled as he came to the realization that he had forgotten all about his awesome, homemade costume that was sure to scare Twilight's mane off. He hid an evil little grin with a nod. All right, but you guys have to put yours on too, he ordered before he darted back upstairs, giggling all the way. Twilight looked at Silver and shrugged, and the 2 ponies made their way up to their respective rooms to don their costumes and get ready for the night of nightmares. Spike tiptoed to the top of the stairs to see Twilight waiting patiently on the floor below for the other 2 to come down and join her, a big bowl of individually wrapped candies and chocolates sitting next to her. She was in her costume, a long, thick robe of a deep royal blue color, with thick lines of gold running along the fabric. It covered her entire body, from neck to hooves, the edges of the robe just barely hanging off of the ground. The wide-brimmed hood of the robe was thrown over her head, so that her horn was barely peeking out from underneath it, and around her neck hung a pendant of a wrought iron star on a simple chain. Spike muffled a maniacal giggle with his claws as he watched his soon-to-be victim look around suspiciously, before emptying a small box of chocolate-covered raisins in her mouth and chewing quickly before hiding the package in the bottom of the bowl. So carefree, so unsuspecting, so easy. He had put so much effort into this costume, even going so far as to ask for Rarity's advice on how to apply makeup so as to make him look even more terrifying. With her instruction, he'd managed to give himself several bright red gashes upon his face and body, and a stitched scar that ran from one eye all the way to his cheek. That, combined with his ratty and torn-up clothes, made for a very convincing zombie indeed. He narrowed his eyes at his prey, licking his lips like a predator would at its next meal. For years he had been trying to give Twilight a good scare by concocting the most intricate and horrifying thing that his immature mind could think of, but it never seemed to work in his favor. He had started off small with that typical white sheet ghost costume, but Twilight had only laughed that off, calling him the most adorable spook she had ever seen. Little did she realize that it only fueled the flame of his ambition, and he knew, deep in his heart, that tonight was the night that he was going to make Twilight jump out of her coat. He rated himself, going over the lines of and in his head. If he was going to do this, he was going to be doing it right, sound effects and everything included. Just as he was readying himself for his dynamic entry, the sound of a door opening behind him made him pause. "Oh, Silverquill," he whispered without turning to look at the stallion. "Watch how I'm gonna scare Twilight. It's gonna be hilarious." Silverquill didn't reply, instead just slowly walking forward to meet Spike at the top of the stairway, his footsteps making a soft noise on the hard wooden floor. Spike's ear fins perked at the noise, and he grimaced irritably. "Hey, keep it down, would you?" he asked as he checked to see if Twilight had heard him. She hadn't, thankfully. She was still waiting by the door, not giving the slightest indication that she felt that anything was amiss. Reassured that his plan had not been prematurely ruined, Spike sighed with relief and began to turn around to face the stallion. "We can't make noise or else she'll..." Spike was cut off as he came face to face with the pony behind him. His words were stolen from him as he looked at the light gray pony wearing a smart black suit with a red necktie over a white undershirt. That in itself wasn't at all strange. But what really stood out to Spike was its face. It didn't have one. The pony with a face as blank as a fresh canvas stared impassively at Spike, or at least it seemed to stare at Spike. He couldn't tell, since it didn't have any eyes. The baby dragon started to tremble under its presence as he started to slowly back away from the pony, his eyes wide and pupils dilated with fright. The back of his foot soon hit the edge of the stairs, and while every voice in his scaly head told him to run down the stairs, out the door and halfway across Equestria, he just couldn't tear his eyes away from the blank face of the pony in front of him. He chattered incoherently. The pony took a step forward, and that was all that was needed to set Spike off. "Slendermane!" he shouted, all thoughts of frightening Twilight thrown out the window as he scrambled down the stairs away from the walking nightmare. He immediately hid himself behind the legs of a nonplussed Twilight who looked down at him with confusion. "Spike?" she asked as she peered at the Drake clutching at her forearm with both arms. "What are you doing?" The inconsolable dragon didn't answer, instead just pointing a trembling claw at the stairway, where a sharply dressed pony with a gray coat and a charcoal black mane was descending. Her eyebrows rose and she looked into the face of the pony, or more specifically, into where the face of the pony should have been. She felt her fur start to stand on end in an unconscious reaction of fear, as her muscles tensed themselves in an instinctual fight-or-flight response. Slendermane. She knew who he was. Every pony did. He was the one who lived in the darkest recesses of the Everfree Forest, the place that fools should never go, lest he snatch them away and take them to his home of nightmares. Every foal was raised with this story, the Everfree Forest being changed to something else depending on the location of the ponies, but the nightmares of foals all over was always there. But Twilight smiled.
"Slendermane has a black tie, not a red one."
The blank-faced pony tilted his head down. "Oh, shoot. I forgot about that." Twilight laughed brightly as the blank-faced pony's visage rippled like a pebble being dropped in a still pond to show Silverquill's grinning face. "Oh well, judging from the reception I've gotten so far, I think it passes," he said as he shot a grin to Spike, who was now looking up at him with bewilderment. The little dragon stepped out from behind Twilight's leg and puffed himself up indignantly. "Hey, I wasn't scared!" he cried out in protest. When the two ponies looked down at him, he shrunk back a bit and looked down at his feet while wringing his claws together.
Much,
he added lamely. Silver chuckled and patted the dragon on the head. Sorry, little guy, Silver said abashedly. I didn't mean to scare you, but by the time you got a good look at me, it was too late. The drake looked up at him with a cheeky grin. It's all right, Silverquill. It's a really convincing costume, so I guess I overreacted slightly.
I'll say,
Twilight added, looking impressed as she eyed his suit.
That's a very well done illusion. You almost even had me scared for a moment there,
she said with a healthy amount of respect. Silver smiled skeptically. You mean I didn't manage to frighten you even a little bit? He teased, knowing full well from the way she had tensed up upon seeing him that he had indeed done so. Twilight merely shook her head and rolled her eyes.
Please, I faced off against Nightmare Moon herself. It'll take a lot more than that to scare me,
she said proudly, holding a hoof up to her chest and taking a little pose as her eyes twinkled with amusement. Silver noticed that the hoof she held up was trembling ever so slightly. He smiled. I see. How silly of me. Twilight opened her mouth to give a no doubt sarcastic reply, but was cut off by the sound of a small foot stamping the ground with irritation. Come on, guys! Nightmare Night's already started and you're just standing here talking! He looked anxiously back and forth between the two ponies. Are we gonna stay inside all night or what? Twilight chuckled and patted the dragon consolingly.
All right.
She looked at Silver apologetically.
We should probably go before he bursts a blood vessel or something.
Silver nodded. Sure, I'm all set, he replied. The baby dragon gave a shout of excitement and ran to the door, scurrying outside like he was already hopped up on sugar, not even remembering to play the part of a zombie like he had been planning. Twilight nodded at him.
After you,
she said politely. Silver smiled. Why, thank you, miss. He trailed off, eyeing her costume with curiosity. Twilight sighed.
Clover the Clever post-unification,
Twilight said, disgruntled. Silver nodded knowingly. Ah, I knew that.
Don't just walk out the door already,
Twilight replied in exasperation. Silver suppressed a laugh, not wanting to incur the wrath of the librarian any more than he had already. He caught her eyes eagerly lingering on him for a little while longer than usual as he walked past her, and couldn't help but grin as he stepped into the cool night air, Twilight shortly following after him. I guess it's true what they say, he thought with amusement as Twilight followed him and set out the bowl of candy on a small table so that they could contribute to the candy as they were out. Every mare's crazy about a sharp-dressed colt.